I see we're only down one commissioner here. When you came in, you didn't have the ability to share video, but you do now. And this meeting is running under a much stricter set of protocols. So things like the chat are missing. And we will get chat turned back on for workshops going forward if we do them these virtual meetings again, just for sharing links and for people who get bored, I guess, and want to play in the chat. Okay.
So since I can't write in the chat, welcome everyone. I just want to say, welcome everyone. It's good to see you.
Yeah, we can send hearts to each other. That's appropriate. Are we expecting Commissioner Blasher? Anybody know? Or is he out for workshop?
Expecting.
I have not heard he's out.
Okay. Yep, I've got a text here. I'll be right back. Okay, he's just running a little late, so I'll leave it up to you, Jennifer, whether you want to get rolling and have him catch up or sit around and send hearts at each other. It's up to you.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
I'm game to roll ahead. I don't know how tight our time is today, so I'm happy if we wanted to get started and catch Jonathan up when he gets here, unless, again, don't know all the details of what we're going to cover. So if you think that what we're hitting up front is important for us all to be here, we can just send hearts for a few more moments.
I think out of everybody here, he's the most familiar with land and water, and we can start with that one right at the top. So I think we can get rolling. And Michelle, and Daniel, I will just turn it over to you. We do have 2 workshops, 1 hour each, one on property disposition and policy and one on land and water conservation fund. Appreciate your time. We are streaming live to YouTube and recording, so that's why my camera's off. But I will turn it over to you, Michelle and Daniel, and we can get rolling.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. Good to see all your faces. Although we're not in person, it is good to be able to see you today. I am going to be starting off with the first part of the workshop today with the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So I'm going to have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to share my screen and presentation, hopefully. Is that okay? Thank you, Jamie, for the affirmative. Okay, great. Well, hopefully this won't go past our allotted hour. I don't think it will. So today, I am Michelle Scalise. I am the manager of the Grants and Community Programs section at OPRD, which is within Central Business Services. Today, we're going to be doing a workshop on the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And for some reason, oh, there we go. Got the slide advanced down, so I'm feeling pretty good. So before we get too far into it, I did want to let you know I'm not going to be presenting the whole agenda by myself today. Cami Bunis is going to join at the end of the Land and Water Conservation Fund presentation to talk about OPRD specific state parks and LWCF specific situations. And also, I'm glad because we're doing it virtual, I was able to have Naomi and CISO, the Land and Water Conservation Fund coordinator, join us today. So with that, good afternoon, Chair Allen, Director Sumption, and staff and members of the commission. So today we're going to cover the history, a brief history of the Land and Water Conservation Fund program. roles within the program. And today we're primarily focusing on stewardship, long-term stewardship of land and water conservation fund projects. And then we will talk a little bit about some of the recent challenges we've been facing in the program on a national level. And as I said before, Cami will cover some state parks, real estate type issues and questions and concerns with LWCF, and just information about how that works within our state parks. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund was established by Congress in 1964. The act went into effect in 1965, and this was due to an increasing consciousness of public health and environmental issues and expanding need for recreational space. And so what that resulted in was a bipartisan commission, which included state, local, federal governments, and the private sector. These key stakeholders got together to in an effort to make more opportunities available for outdoor recreation. So here's a nice, I love these old timey photos. Here's a nice photo of President Johnson signing into law the Land and Water Conservation Fund program. And to this day, actually, the Land and Water Conservation Fund program does enjoy bipartisan support. And it was actually in 2019, the fund was permanently authorized, meaning that this program is here to stay. So as far as getting into the roles of the program is split into a state side and a federal side. So the part that we're discussing primarily today is the state matching grant program, and that is the program that OPRD is responsible for in the state of Oregon. The federal side is for land acquisitions, and that goes directly through the federal government to federal land management agencies like BLM, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, that type of agency for land acquisition. So on our side, on the state side, we do have two parts as well. We have eligible project sponsors that, so we do provide matching grants to state, local governments, and tribes. And of the local government side, not less than 60% of our annual apportionment is set aside for cities, counties, parks and recreation districts, metro, port districts, and federally recognized tribes. And then the state government side is up to 40% goes to state agencies such as our agency, OPRD, Department of Fish and Wildlife, Forestry, and Department of State Lands. And so typically we don't award 40% to state government. We have more interest from the local communities lately. And so if there isn't 40% used, then that rest of the money goes back to the local government section. Okay, so what does the Land and Water Conservation Fund do? Well, it provides matching grants to state and local governments for public outdoor recreation areas and facilities, which include acquisition, development, rehabilitation. It also funds the SCORP, helps fund, we can get a grant at OPRD for 50% of the cost of the SCORP. And so OPRD is the only agency eligible to receive funding for a planning grant. And really the main, one of the main mainstays of this program is to permanently protect, preserve, and develop public outdoor recreation for use by present and future generations, and actually in perpetuity. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So more on the rules. So this is a pass-through grant program, meaning that we get the funds from the National Park Service, they come into state parks, and then we award those out to local project sponsors, as I just defined. And also, we do work, directly with the Department of Interior. We, as the state agency, are the main contact for all of our project sponsors in the state. So there's no direct contact between typically between our project sponsors and grantees and National Park Service. It's our role to be the liaison. Every state that participates in the Land and Water Conservation Fund must have a state liaison officer who is nominated and put forth by the governor. So the role of the state liaison officer is, there are many facets to that, but mainly, we want to make sure that we're implementing the ongoing state outdoor recreation plan, or SCORP, in the planning process. We're responsible for evaluation and selection of projects in accordance with the SCORP, and the open project selection process. So the open project selection process has to do with the criteria for grants and the scoring, how we score and select projects. Also, the SLO in the state of Oregon is responsible for financial management of apportionments and ensuring compliance of projects. And that's where the stewardship comes in. So we also, because of the stewardship, we are responsible for inspecting projects to ensure that projects have been completed properly and that stay in recreation in perpetuity. I see I have a hand from Vicki.
Michelle, before you get too much further, go back one slide if you can, and tell me, one is, you said the state liaison officer has to be appointed by the governor, so it is an individual, not an agency, and is that individual you, or is it Lisa?
Yes. So the state liaison officer in Oregon is Lisa. That's who's appointed by the governor. And then also we have alternate state liaison officers, and I'm an alternate. I believe Chris Havel's an alternate, and Daniel Killam is an alternate. So it is an individual. It's also, sometimes, as I've referred to, kind of the overall program responsibility. But yes, you're correct. It's an
Okay,
individual.
so you got the arrows on top. Now I understand. Are you going to explain the arrows on the bottom at some point?
I can explain that now.
Okay.
So basically, what these are meant to show is that we have a project sponsor that has a couple different roles with us. So the project sponsor is the applicant or grantee. And then the applicant or grantee, come to OPRD for either applying for new grant funds, or if they're having, like a compliance issue or stewardship issue. So that's the green arrow below. And then goes through OPRD, and then we work directly to the National Park Service, either with grant programs or with compliance issues. And so the reason, yeah, go ahead.
So if I'm understanding it's a sort of an interesting dynamic, this chart, because the money comes out of the Department of the Interior, of which the Park Service is a part, but so you're really answerable to the National Park Service, but the money comes out of the Department of the Interior.
Yes. So yes, National Park Service, being a part of the Department of the Interior, is in charge of the Land and Water Conservation Fund program, or the stateside assistance program. So I probably should back up to the earlier slide. Let me go back a couple slides here. So the one fund and two programs, there's the federal side. I do not believe that I actually don't know how that's administered through the Department of the Interior. I'm not sure that it's the same folks that we work with. It's probably still through National Park Service. The state matching grant program, which is in is a national program, is managed by the state assistance program with the National Park Service. And so that's where, that's 60% of the program is for the state program, and the remaining is for the federal side on that, which is one breakdown. And then the other breakdown we have, once we've received our apportionment, is that we break our funds down to local and tribes is one set of eligible project sponsors or grantees. And then the other 40% up to 40% is available for these state agencies.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I didn't mean to sidetrack you. I just wanted to know if it was an individual or an agency. And I got it.
Yes. Good question.
Those were great questions, Commissioner Berger.
Yes.
And it doesn't always sit in state parks. It could be in a different agency. So it is different depending on the state and how we're structured.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how it's administered. I can visualize that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do think that you are, the previous visual is kind of meant to show that, the National Park Service within the Department of Interior really is the, if we're doing more of a hierarchy showing here, we're responsible for all the projects in the state of Oregon. The Department of Interior and National Park Services is responsible for the whole overarching program of the country and territories.
Thank you.
So yeah, you're welcome. So let's see. So one of the main points of the Land and Water Conservation Fund is to provide matching grants to state and local governments for outdoor recreation. And each year, all US state and territories receive a funding apportionment using a population-based formula. And so, this has been, since the program started in 1965, the funds have been a vitally important tool to renovate existing sites, develop new outdoor recreation facilities, acquire land for state and local parks, and to promote statewide recreation planning via the SCORP. So we're back to this slide, and I think I can forward through that one now. Are we good? Okay. So back to the responsibilities of the SLO. So again, Lisa and the agency through Lisa are responsible for a number of things, including the implementation of the SCORP, making sure that we're financially responsible, making sure that projects are in compliance throughout the state. So I'm referencing here section 6F3 of the LWCF Act, which actually is no longer called section 6F3. They've renumbered it, but because for so long people refer to LWCF projects as 6F, we're going to leave that in there just so that we're all familiar with the terminology. And so this piece right here, where the Act says that, once you receive funding, no property acquired or developed with the assistance under this section can be converted to uses other than public outdoor recreation uses. And in here, you see that it also says without the approval of the Secretary, they mean the Secretary of the Interior. So this is where that's kind of, keep that in mind, and we're going to talk about stewardship responsibilities. So stewardship responsibilities, it's really about protecting parklands forever. We have the local sponsors that are responsible for their projects, site stewardship, public access, safety, other basic maintenance on their assisted sites. OPRD is responsible for site stewardship at state parks, and also working with local partners to ensure that Land and Water Conservation Fund stewardship goals are met, meaning keeping in compliance. So really the message I'm trying to get across here is that OPRD is actually ultimately responsible for all of the sites, assisted sites in the state of Oregon, whether it was a grant that was given to a local agency or one that OPRD received for development or acquisition. One of the things that we do to ensure that stewardship is taking place and that projects are in compliance is that we do site visits at these parks or do some kind of self-certification inspection once every 5 years for each of the projects in the state. And then during these site inspections, sometimes we do find compliance issues. So one of the things, and some of you may or may not be familiar with the term conversion. So the conversion protection process is a process to receive approval to change the use within a protected park boundary to non-recreation or private recreation use. And a conversion, the way to resolve taking a property that was assisted with LWCF out of recreation use and taking the responsibilities off of that piece of property is to replace the property with land of equal or greater appraised value and equivalent recreational usefulness. So that's kind of the recreational usefulness piece is a little bit harder to define, but we work with our project sponsors and National Park Service to, make sure that when we are replacing property, it meets those same recreational uses or similar. It doesn't have to be like for like. However, the replacement property is based on today's fair market value, based on a Yellow Book appraisal. So what that means is even if the assistance occurred in 1982, the value of the property that's being converted out of recreation use would be based on a contemporary value, as well as the replacement property. So that's where it can sometimes be a little bit difficult. So what can trigger a conversion? A number of things, but these are kind of like the high level definitions of what triggers a conversion. So it's when parks or properties that were funded with LWCF or our pass-through funds are conveyed for private use or non-public outdoor recreation uses. Non-outdoor recreation uses are made of the park or project area, maybe just part of it. Unallowable indoor facilities are developed in the park without approval or some kind of pre-authorization. Sometimes sheltering an outdoor facility would cause this, sometimes not. And I'll talk about some of the other possibilities for doing some things like this that might not trigger a conversion. So obviously this is a public outdoor recreation program. So if the project is not any longer open and available to the public, that would constitute a conversion. So things that may not necessarily trigger a conversion include underground utility easements that don't impact the overall recreational use of the park. And then if things can be returned to their original condition. Sometimes proposals to construct public facilities are not a conversion. And that's where, we would have to show, the project sponsor would have to show, and we as the state would have to support and demonstrate to National Park Service that the public facility actually is an enhancement to the outdoor recreation. So the outdoor recreation is always going to be in the forefront of what happens at that park. So sometimes it's allowed. Also, they do have a policy for temporary non-conforming uses. So if there is an activity going on in the park that's not recreational, like some kind of, construction work that doesn't have to do with recreation, that can exist for up to 6 months in the park without triggering a conversion. And I kind of talked about this before, proposals to build sheltered facilities, provided that they do not change the overall public outdoor recreation characteristics. So, it's good that we do have project sponsors that are very concerned about everything that they're doing in their assisted parks. Typically there is, the things that they come to us and ask us about, typically there could be a way other than a conversion to just record what is going on for the record and work with NPS to keep that in the park system. So the conversions, as I've described it is a way out of that in perpetuity requirement for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but there is a need for conversions at times. I mean, there are common things that happen like mandated improvements to transportation, like highway widenings, changing demographics leading to obsolete recreation facilities, negative impacts from adjacent land use. So, a project sponsor might have something going in right next to their park that kind of does not make the park very enjoyable any longer for recreation use. So they will decide that they might want to replace the property. And it's very obvious that change is inevitable, and sometimes we've looked at all the alternatives and we've reviewed everything. Conversions can be deemed both necessary and desirable. So we will process those as necessary. So just wanted to kind of give you an idea of the stewardship area that we're responsible for as an agency. These blue dots on this map represent all the projects that have been funded in Oregon since the beginning of the Land and Water Program in 1965. A total of $81.5 million in grants have been awarded via 1,490 some grant agreements. So there are quite a few projects out there. And as I mentioned before, we're responsible for making sure monitoring these and doing either a virtual or in-person inspection once every 5 years. So some of the tools that we use, we have a grant system where we can track grants, and we have turned all of the paper files, because we have lots and lots of paper files, as you can imagine. If we're dating back to 1965 on these projects, we've been able to digitize those and upload those to our online grant system. And so grantees or project sponsors have access to their files at any time. We also have this really cool tool here that was developed by our GIS department, which shows the boundaries at all of the parks that have received LWCF assistance. And we can use it as staff, and it's also a really valuable tool for our project sponsors. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Naomi for a moment to talk about, we're going to step a little bit away from the stewardship piece and just recent challenges that we've experienced with this program.
Thank you, Michelle. So good afternoon. My name is Naomi Enciso. Like Michelle said, I'm the Land and Water Conservation Fund coordinator for the program. Thank you for your time. So these challenges that I will talk about today are more so related to brand new project applications, so brand new grants, but they're definitely important and something I'd like to share with you all. I'll also mention that these challenges are not specific to Oregon. So I do meet with a group of Western states about once a month, and we talk about all things land and water. These concerns are a recurring topic of conversation, and so I don't doubt that the rest of the states and territories may also be experiencing similar challenges and concerns. And I'll also note that there's kind of a snowball effect. And so you'll notice as I talk more through these bullet points that some of the bullet points lead to the next one, and they're all kind of interlinked. And then lastly, I'll mention that National Park Service is aware of these challenges, and they are actively looking to improve their process and administration of these grants. So let's go ahead and dive in. So bullet point number one, a couple of years ago, we were transferred from the Seattle, Washington office to the Midwest region office. And what that means is we are assigned a National Park Service program officer who we would work with directly for grants and to work through any compliance or stewardship issues. And so the change happened a couple of years ago. And with that, of course, there's kind of different interpretations of programs and expectations. And we unfortunately were not made aware of these differences until we submitted the first round of grant applications following the transfer. So that happened, the new round of applications happened in 2020. And we are kind of still working through some of those changes. Additionally, there has been a lot of staffing and turnover changes in the National Park Service office. The good news is that, as I mentioned, they're working on actively improving the process. And so they are building their workforce. the National Park Service does have plans to open an office in Denver, Colorado in the near future for additional support. And we expect that we will be transferred to that office and assigned to a brand new program officer who will then have a smaller number of states to focus on and work with. So at this time, program officers have a higher volume of states that they ideally would be working with if it were a regular, unchallenging time. So let's see here. And of course, we do expect that once we are transferred to our new program officer, there will be learning curves. So working with them to kind of train one another in what we expect to have complete in the program. So all of these changes and transfers were not aided at all by the COVID pandemic. And so that happened in 2020, of course. And because of that, some of the federal compliance processes were adversely affected. So more specifically, the Section 106 portion of the National Historic Preservation Act. So that requires consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office and the different tribes. So a lot of these parties that we would consult with were unable to carry out their responsibilities due to unavailability of staff or just COVID pandemic related issues. And so that really hampered when we would receive these brand new grant applications that we submitted diligently in middle of 2020. We are kind of at the tail end of receiving the awards for those projects. We actually just received a couple of weeks ago almost the last two staggering applications that we submitted back then, and we have one more to go. And then officially all of our 2020 projects would have been awarded. The other thing that kind of is delaying receiving federal grants is just the growing number of the growing apportionment amount. And so growing apportionments means, of course, we have more funding to award. We do expect to see either a higher volume of applications or just larger dollar amounts being requested. And so that, of course, just the higher volume of applications is more workload for both our staff and for the National Park Service, which can, of course, cause delays. So all of these things combined are the creation for a great storm that we don't want to see anymore. The other thing that we have experienced is just, of course, the rising in construction costs. And so especially with these 2020 projects that we submitted, June of 2020, those that were just awarded a couple of weeks ago have seen significant changes, rises to their construction costs with each year that they didn't receive the award. Of course, they are unable to start construction and break ground until we have that award in hand. And so that's been quite unfortunate. The other thing that happened recently was on November 15th of 2021, President Biden signed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which includes the Build America, Buy America Act. And basically what that means is the Build America, Buy America Act adds a preference to the federal financial assistance programs for infrastructure that requires all iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials used in the project to be produced in the United States. And so, for instance, these last two that we just received, because those awards were received after the act came into law, those requirements now apply to these grants that did not initially anticipate such a requirement. It was not in their budget or in their scope. And so we are definitely working with some challenges there. That's a brand new requirement for the National Park Service as far as the Land and Water program goes. And so they are kind of still working through what that process will look like. There's an option to request a waiver that process hasn't been implemented yet. They're kind of still working through that. And of course, all of these things, what that means for our project sponsors is delays in getting their money and delays in being able to start the project. Any questions?
Naomi, did you have an example maybe of a situation that you would kind of demonstrates maybe, kind of in a nutshell, the issues that we've been experiencing?
Yes, so the project that comes top of mind is over in the city of St. Helens. They submitted their project application to us very diligently back in early 2020. We prepared their packet and submitted that to National Park Service summer of 2020. And they are ones who we just received their federal award for just a couple of weeks ago. They are proposing to construct a boardwalk that will include lots of steel and just products that are now affected and needing to be compliant with Disney requirements. And so the unfortunate thing that we're kind of working through is kind of gathering information and doing research to see how much that will affect their project budget and which of the 3 waiver options we should pursue in order to allow them to do their project. So City of St. Helens with their boardwalk. And they actually also received a local government grant program for part of their match. And of course, they have not been able to start that project because we've been waiting for this federal award. A couple of hands. Let's see, so I think I saw Vicky's hand first, Commissioner Vicky.
Hi, Naomi. You said that you now have the 2020 grants all through the feds. Is that correct?
Mostly. So there's just one outstanding grant that I expect to receive by end of this month. We're nearing the end of the federal fiscal year. And so that grant is Hermison. It's for that I think we only received a handful. So majority of them have been trickling in. As far as our last grant cycle in 2021, we had 5 grant applications. So a much smaller volume. And those, because we are using our fiscal year 2020 apportionment, which expires this year, should mostly all be awarded by end of this month, with the exception of 2, because those need cultural resource surveys. And so that takes a little bit more work to complete 106.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hill.
Yeah, I think you answered part of my question at how long do we have for it to expire, and will it roll over for a certain amount of time?
Yeah, so we have 3 years before the apportionment expires. And the good thing is that our open project selection process, as written in the SCORP, allows for us to, if we don't have enough projects to obligate all of those funds, we can offer them to the local government grant projects that were not selected, that were maybe under the cutoff line. So that's actually something that we're talking about with one of the recipients, or one of the projects that fell under the last cutoff line for local government, to kind of try and use more of those funds. So
And do we typically use all of our funds, or have we had to return some?
So I started with the program just a little over 2.5 years. And since then, we have not had to return any funds. Michelle might be able to speak to the time before I came on board.
Yeah, so there is a process. Thank you, Naomi. Great job with your presentation. Yeah, so we have had an incident. So we do have a way to, if we don't spend all of our funds, or if we award funds and a project closes or cancels and we have money on the table that was part of that 3-year apportionment, we can put it back into what's called a special reapportionment account. We have not had an issue with awarding out apportionments within the 3-year time period. But if we get money back, there's a shorter time clock on that, and that's called the special reapportionment account. And I am aware of a time, right before I started, because before I was in this position, I was in the position Naomi was in. Before I started this position, the agency had lost about $74,000 in out of our apportionment because we just didn't have projects. And there was a period of time where we didn't, there was no staffing for the position for the land and water program. So there were a few years where we didn't have any grants awarded. But since, I would say at least since 2012 or 13, we have not lost any funds in the program. But that is something to be concerned about as the apportionments increase. And where we aren't in these last couple of grant cycles, I don't believe we were able to have enough projects to award out all that was available. So we will carry that over to the next grant cycle, but that could be an issue we would see in the future, is the possibility of losing some funding if we don't get that out.
What is the apportionment amount, or it just on average for the next year and following year?
Yeah,
I
have
have that up,
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have that. I knew that question might come up. Let's see here. So the last apportionment we received for 2022 was a little over $4 million. And the year before that was 4.3. The year before that, it was 3.2. So we're seeing it grow, little by little each year. So although this year was about a 7% drop in what we received last year, it's still almost double than what we received in years past. So I don't know if, Michelle, this is something in your presentation today, but we have changed to an annual grant cycle so that we can try and obligate more of these funds, because prior to me coming on board, we were doing a grant cycle every other year just so we can have enough money to offer a substantial grant round.
Mm-hmm. What's the average grant amount that comes in?
So that really varies. In the last grant cycle, we received an application request for as little as $50,000. And then the largest one was, oh geez, I want to say it was over 600,000, but maybe don't quote me on that. So it really just ranges. But I just think that now with the larger amount that we are having in our grant cycles, that number can very well increase.
Makes sense. Okay, I'll stop hogging all the time. Thank you very much. That was helpful.
Yeah, and we also, I see Chair Allen has a question.
Yeah, I just had a question, and maybe it's just looking for some examples of where we have other kinds of grants that go to local communities and things like that. And are there efforts to both strategically complement investments that are being made locally by looking at how can the different kinds of colors of grants can come together to support a project, and sort of like, what's the process for if a local community comes to OPRD with a need, saying, what's the best avenue for you to follow in terms of seeking resources? So I think that our grant coordinators are really good. We're really good at talking with one another. And so if a sponsor or an applicant is interested in applying for one of our programs, we might kind of tap on the other's shoulder and just kind of have a meeting with them to explain both opportunities. A lot of times our programs can match one another. And so the amount coming from the sponsor is reduced significantly, even maybe to zero at some times. So we do a good job at just communicating. Great, thanks.
Yeah, and Naomi's correct. We have, I will say that the grant staff is incredible, very talented group of folks that know their stuff and know not just their own programs that they award, but all of our others. And so we do have workshops and opportunities for training for applicants, and those things are also discussed. I would say, even as recently as this last grant cycle, we have projects that have, recreation trails, matching, the local government grant program or LWCF or any combination of those. We do see quite often LWCF and local government grants matching each other because they're very similar programs. So with that, thank you so much, Naomi. I really am so glad that although you know, we weren't able to travel to Klamath Falls, I'm so glad that this gave us an opportunity to have you join us today. And just go ahead and hang on because there might be questions here at the end, more questions for you. I did want to say, I kind of alluded to earlier that we're focusing on stewardship today. I did expect to have some questions about the granting process and finance and things like that in our apportionments. We do plan to at a later time do another workshop on LWCF to go more into the funding part, because you don't want to hear from us for like 5 hours today, I'm sure. So try and kind of give it to you in more manageable pieces. Okay, well, with that, I did want to mention that the LWCF challenges, and Naomi mentioned it as well, are not just exclusive to Oregon. These are challenges that have been happening to our counterparts in other states and territories. And Naomi has done a wonderful job of setting up that she also didn't mention that meeting that she has with the Western states. She has set up and continues to hold that meeting and has done a really great job communicating with our other states so that we can kind of problem solve and share ideas together. So that's really great. And, we tend to hear the same issues in Washington, Idaho, Hawaii, the other states that we're talking to on those calls. One of the places where we hear, can get together and hear about the national issues of the program-wide issues is there's NASORLO, the National Association of State Outdoor Recreation Liaison Officers, of which Lisa is a member, where the alternates are a member, and the state of Oregon is benefits from the work that they do on a national level. With that, I didn't really talk to Lisa about when we were going to have her talk about this, but she did say that she'd like to speak a little bit to her perspective and just conversations she's been having and things that she knows about the issues we're having. So Lisa, did you want to take this opportunity to talk about this a little bit?
I would be happy to share a couple perspectives. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So Naomi and Michelle are being very kind. These are really nationwide issues, and we're having some experiences that are less than desirable. So between the National Association of State Outdoor Recreation Liaison Officers, NASORLO, and the National Association of State Park Directors, we have actually worked together, and we have a liaison right now helping us lobby some efforts back in DC to try to help National Park Service get their focus a little bit more clear. As Naomi and Michelle both mentioned, they have a lot more opportunities within the program, and I don't believe that they're staffed appropriately. But many of us SLOs and directors of state parks have actually offered up assistance and support and help to try to help them get back on track. The challenges we're having seem minimal when I talk to my counterparts across the country. It has not been going well at all. Their staff, from what I understand, they're about 30 staff members short in this program, and they would need to get folks hired and trained, which could take another year or two. So there are also some concerns if some of this could be intentional or political, to be able to take the funding and do something different with it. So all of those things are on our radar and keeping many of us SLOs up at night. So don't worry, we're working on it. And Director Sands from National Park Service has recently appointed Deputy Director Mike Reynolds, and he was just at our conference last week and assured us that this is his #1 top priority, and he's going to figure out how to facilitate a conversation between the SLOs and the National Park Service staff to try to help figure out how to get us back on track and get the program back up and functioning the way that it used to, and the way that most of the other NPS programs currently are functioning. So that is the hot off the presses update, and Michelle would be happy to answer any of your technical difficult questions.
Thanks, Thanks, Lisa. And yeah, Naomi and I talked about this before, and our approach to talking about these issues. And it's a challenging program. There's no doubt about it. One, the compliance and stewardship part that I talked about, and just the gigantic amount of projects that we have to manage and inspect and make sure in compliance. And then the funding part was always kind of the part that was the fun and a little bit easier. Not that it didn't come with its challenges, but nothing like what we've experienced pretty much since, I'd say, 2019, around the time that Naomi joined. And that nothing to do with Naomi. I think we're very, 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 very fortunate to have Naomi on board,
Yes.
dealing with these issues, because it has been it has been a pretty tough couple of years. And then, like Naomi said, adding the pandemic related issues on top of that is a challenge to any of our grant programs and project sponsors. So they do sound like they're trying to hire and fill all those positions that they're very short on. And, I've talked to the Midwest, a regional contact there, and he's pretty confident. He feels like after these people that they're hiring on now are trained and come up to speed on the program, that things will run a little bit more smoothly like they used to, because we did have really good, communication and things were moving through pretty quickly. Now, I will say that Naomi does have regular communication with NPS, and that's good. There are other states that can't say the same. So I think you're right, Lisa, in that we are fortunate in a couple of ways, but it is a challenging time. So, okay, well, I believe the next slides, I'm going to pass, I can advance through these slides for you, Cami, if you just tell me when to. I'm going to pass off to Cami, and then we'll, be around at the end for any questions, either related to the things that Cami's presenting or the things that Naomi and I talked about.
Thanks, Michelle. For the record, my name's Cami Bunis. I'm a property agent with the Real Estate Services section of OPRD. I worked for the agency from 2012 to 2019. Sounds like I left at just the right time. And now I'm back again, happy to say, to help out the permanent staff. Alice Beals and I are back on as temporaries to help out. So I'm just going to briefly sort of put on that hat of the sponsor. So here we are, Parks and Recreation, as the sponsor of land and water applications and projects. This is just showing you a map of the distribution of land and water funds at state parks and other state park sites across the state. And on the next slide, we have sort of a summation of 193 agreements to date. That doesn't mean 193 sites. Some of our sites might have multiple grants gained over the years, but you can see a total of more than $30 million in land and water funding has come to our agency over the decades, with the initiation of the program showing quite a bit of activity, 42 agreements in a 5-year period. So I think that 1964 must have been the application year, and then the funding award would have come in 65. And then you can also see that in a period of 21 years, we've had just 20 agreements. So our activity in terms of pursuing new grants has dropped off quite a bit in recent years for a number of reasons, and certainly not least of those being some of the compliance issues that we find ourselves challenged with. And I would say, in hindsight, right, we would have done things differently. And that is true, I think, nationwide as well. What a great program. It really kicked off parks and recreation funding across the country, and in many areas where there hadn't been any state funding, really much of an investment at all. So in those early years, we're going great guns and getting awards for land acquisition and development. And it really was before we had that ability to understand what encumbering a site with what we call fondly the 6F boundary would mean down the road. And then I would also say that because we cleaved off from Department of Transportation, many of the acquisitions that were made with the goal of highway improvements, and then leftover land was dedicated for park purposes, scenic viewpoints, parks, trails, many other uses. And those boundary complications of demarcating where the highway is, what's the right of way that extends beyond the actual asphalt, that was not really made clear on older maps. So I've kind of captured that as one of the challenges, being inadequate maps. On the next slide, there's a sort of an example of this. So the date down in the right corner is showing you that this is an early project. We're out at Carl Washburn Memorial Park, which is just north of Florence, about 12 miles or so. So Highway 101 is shown on this map, and you basically are seeing a Sharpie pen used to outline the boundary in the heavy black marker. Not a lot of detail on this map, and it would give you the impression that the 6F boundary would end right there to the west at the end of the uplands. On the following slide, we're going to show you a map that Alice Beals did a few years back. I think it was 2017. Quite an effort was made to update some of our boundary maps so that we could reflect the real world. And we had a federal officer at the time who became aware of the utility line on this map shown in green, with the park boundary outlined in the black and white dash mark. So that utility easement existed at the time the park was established, but it was never placed on that original 6F map. And so that became a compliance issue in more recent times. And you can also see the boundary map is now encompassing part of the ocean shore. When you do an acquisition project with land and water, your legal description becomes your 6F boundary, and it wasn't always reflected accurately on those early maps. So just wanting to show you that we've been able to work with the National Park Service through Michelle's group in the past to clarify issues and avoid what appeared to be a compliance issue, but really was just a lack of good mapping to begin with. On the next slide, talking about how we might pursue some of these grants going forward. Certainly now, before maybe I talk about pursuing additional monies, one thing we have to keep in mind as park staff and managers is we want to avoid inadvertent conversions. And so if we don't communicate well to field staff and be sure they understand the implications of the land and water boundary, then through no ill intent, conversion can occur. And if it does, then certainly we are on the hook for resolving that conversion and the time and money it takes to do that. So, one of our best strategies is to avoid conversion when possible. But the benefits of future investments would be the opportunity to leverage state dollars. And if we're careful about what we choose to apply for, we may be able to take advantage of this additional funding coming available. So I would think focusing on sites that already have a 6F boundary is a good strategy, and certainly projects that are the best fit for the program. I'm thinking about Ecola State Park, We already have funding there. We have some access challenges, and this would be, a program that could potentially help us acquire lands needed to address that. So across the state, thinking about where we already have the investment and what opportunities we might have to make additional investments there without encumbering new sites. And then every land acquisition that we think of, maybe we ask, could we use this to resolve a conversion? It's very sad to realize that you bought a piece of property and it could have been used successfully to resolve a conversion, but we didn't think about it far enough in advance to get that federal standard, appraisal, or at least to do the heads up and say, hey, we're gonna acquire this, get a placeholder in place before you take the title. Once you take title to property, it's not eligible anymore. But we should also be asking, not just can we use this, but should we? Should we put a land and water boundary on this acquisition that we're anticipating? And then my final advice is to be wary, but not afraid. So, it's a complicated program, as you've been hearing, but I do think there's a way to use it to our gain. And as we think of more funds becoming available, perhaps we can give it some thought on where we might want to apply for funds. That's it for me, Michelle.
Thanks, Cami. And that is a really good point, not only for OPRD and for state parks property. We do advise also, local project sponsors. This is one of the things we advise them from their first interest in the program. We do tell them right up front these requirements of the program and that they are in perpetuity. And so it is, it's something to really give thought to. We do also recommend that those projects that have an existing LWCF boundary should apply for more funding, because the boundary is there. It's already there permanently. And so those are really the best fit for getting additional funding. Other, projects that don't have a boundary yet can apply, but then we're adding another boundary to our portfolio that does need to be inspected and that we do have to follow up with compliance. So it is a good strategy. It's got quite a bit of funding in there. And so I do think, taking advantage of it for folks that already are committed to the program through an existing boundary is the way to go. So with that, I believe we are just at our hour, or maybe slightly over, but I did want to open it up for questions. And I believe then after this, Cami is going to be speaking on disposition of property in addition to this LWCF topic. I see Dennis has a question.
So what I'm hearing is that you can't buy the property, then re-obligate it to LWCF after you've purchased it. But how fast or how nimble is that money available if a piece of property comes available for us to purchase and the seller is moving quickly on it? How do you do that and retain the advantage of LWCF in a location where we're already planted with LWCF?
That's a great question, Dennis, and I'm glad you asked it. So if you're thinking of applying to Land and Water, anyone is thinking to apply to Land and Water Conservation Fund for an acquisition, actually the Land and Water Conservation Fund program does have a waiver of retroactivity for purchasing property. So if there is a piece of property that opportunity might not exist, and as you know, that's how it does work with property. It's not going to sit there for for example, if people applied in 2020, right, and Naomi's just getting grants coming through, despite all of her doing all the work and submitting them 2 years ago, that's not going to work for an acquisition. So what we would do is there is a certain amount of paperwork, not too terrible, but we do need the potential applicant to submit a request for a waiver, which would allow them to purchase the property and then apply in the very next grant cycle. So they, if the next grant cycle isn't until next year, then they could acquire it now as long as they have this waiver that we approve. We recommend to National Park Service, and if National Park Service approves it, then they can go ahead. If they can find a way to purchase it, maybe, I don't know, with help of a land trust or other monies that they have, then they can do that.
I'm thinking more like us, not necessarily they, but us.
Yeah, same with us.
Okay.
Yeah, same. And that is, like, Cami kind of alluded to that too. In the grant section, we're in a little bit of a unique situation because we are part of OPRD for sure. When it comes to the agency and parks receiving grants, and then when we're dealing with those, then we've got our National Park Service LWCF hat on. So that's when I say they as
Okay.
project sponsors.
They
So
is
yes,
us.
yeah, so eligible to any project sponsors as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And so, Michelle, that might be a good time to also mention that because we are the SLO and we administer the program on behalf of National Park Service, that there are times when some of the local organizations may or may not have complied with some of the compliance. Thinking of Jackson County in particular. And so there are times that we may withhold their ability to apply for other grants within the agency until they come into a compliance. And we have one we're currently working with now that I'm hopeful we'll get there, but it's for those similar reasons that both Cami and Naomi and Michelle have all mentioned, that it's a very complicated program and people think, well, I'll deal with that later, and or it doesn't apply to us, or that hot dog stand they want to put in the middle of recreation, that's recreation, right? Hot dogs are fun and recreational, and they think that they can try to move something that really doesn't apply to the criteria that would be eligible. So there's that piece too, which gets to Dennis's question.
Yeah, and you're right, that is always a topic, and it's not very popular when we have an applicant come to apply to one of our other very popular grant programs, like the local government grant program, and we mention, hey, you have this issue that we've been trying to work out and we haven't gotten very far, as the agency responsible for a lot of grant programs. And in the recreation grant sections, we have 5 grant programs. It is a tool that we have to, make sure that the compliance and stewardship of this program is there. And so, it's not a very popular thing to hear, for some of these applicants, that they're like, well, I'm out of compliance with this one, but not with this one, so I'm going to go for that money. And, I don't think, for us being responsible for that program, ultimately, as I said before, OPRD is responsible for any compliance or conversion issues. So if we have a project sponsor out there that does not comply and so they have a conversion, they're supposed to replace property, National Park Service ultimately is going to look at us to resolve that, and we don't want that. So that's where we do have some tools in our rules, administrative rules for all the grant programs, stating that you have to be, in compliance with these conversion requirements, or at least on your way, communicating with us, submitting paperwork, and on the way to, some kind of resolution. Conversions do take a lot of time. There's many issues that you can run into along the way with appraisals, finding property, agreeing on the boundary, 106, NEPA, all of that. Every single one of those steps along the way can really be problematic. And so it can take a couple of years or longer, depending on the willingness and participation of the local sponsor to get that done. So, it is something to be aware of. Any other questions?
I just want to thank you, Michelle and Noemi, and I know we're going to hear more from you, Cami, but it's wonderful to see you back. So thanks that was a great presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Right, awesome. Matt, yeah, we can swing right into you and Cami taking over. Give Cami's vocal cords a rest, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got kind of a quick intro, and then Cami will help kind of facilitate. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you. Although I have to say, like Michelle mentioned, I was looking forward to seeing you all in person, as well as a bunch of the work that's been done down at Collier. I was anxious to kind of check up and see how that's coming along. I think they've been able to get just a ton of stuff down there, but I'll take it. This is better than nothing. So I'm here with Cami today. We wanted to kind of pick up the property policy discussion again. This is really meant to be pretty informal. What Cami and I want to do is for lack of a better way to put it, pick your brain, so that as we're putting a draft policy together for review in November, we've got a sense of the pieces that are important that we want to make sure and include in that. And so we'll ask you some questions. We'll take the feedback from today, build that into a draft policy, and again, bring that back to you for an initial review at the workshop in November. We're only going to be talking about the disposition policy today. In looking at the acquisition policy, it's really based entirely, almost verbatim, on administrative rule, and so there's not as much urgency to change the acquisition policy or to update that right now as there is the disposition policy. If you remember from June, the last time the disposition policy was updated, it was 1991, so it's been a little while. And I think that we could probably anticipate that we'll continue to have other agencies and entities express interest in OPRD properties similar to Lynn County and Cascadia. And by updating this, it's really going to give us what we need to defend, whether we're able or unable to potentially, dispose of a property to another agency. There's other reasons, but that's definitely, in my mind, one of the most important things. Because this is policy, it's meant to be very broad, and then within the procedures, we'll be able to narrow down some specifics around how that process works. But the policy itself really is meant to provide kind of the philosophy and the guidance from the commission and from the agency about how we go about identifying and disposing of property. Let's see, I think with that, I'll hand it over to Cami. She's, we've got some questions, and Cami's going to kind of facilitate just talking through and really working on figuring out what are the most important components that we want to make sure are in this policy.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so for the record, Cami Bunis, property agent with the Real Estate Services. And we did send you some materials last week. I think it was late last week, to try to tee up the conversation for you today. And as Matt said, the last officially adopted policy for land disposal is 1991. But I can tell you that in about 2013, a lot of effort was put into considerations and criteria for how we might consider a property no longer essential to the park system. At that time, there were new park plans being done. The statewide plan, the park system plan, was really identifying how the costs for OPRD, were going to be going up steadily over time, and revenue would not. And so what do we need to do to potentially reposition sort of our land holdings in order to make the most of the park system? And over the decades, the state parks has transferred some properties to local government, other state agencies. Properties have been sold over time. And so in 2014, I think it was, we just really took a really hard look at how to gather up all that information from past effort and turn it into something that might help us as a tool moving forward for when we should consider a piece of property no longer essential to the state park system. And there actually is a term, it's in the LCDC, Land Conservation and Development Department. It's in their administrative rule about endowment property. So past commissioners felt endowment really spoke more to property that you expect to generate income off of. And I think it was 2013 when those commissioners came up with the non-essential property term. So that's our working definition for land that's no longer needed for the state park system. And so disposition of real property really means removing it from designation as state park managed property. And we could choose to hold on to ownership and manage it with minimal resources or lease it to another entity. Or we could choose to dispose of it through a no-cost transfer when somebody would, not somebody, but another entity would continue to manage it for outdoor recreation or public purposes. We could exchange it, for example, to another agency for land that they currently had that would better fit our need, and our land could then go into their portfolio. We can also do exchanges with private entities, and we can also sell property on the open market. That remains an option to us. Anytime you're removing property from the portfolio, that really is kind of a potentially irreversible decision. So it requires great care and deliberation, and of course, public input as well, and needs to be carefully analyzed. We have a list that, I'm sorry, I can't give you an exact number, but I think it was as of 2015, we had at least a couple of dozen and maybe more properties on the list that needed to be analyzed for potential disposition, and hence coming up with criteria and that sort of thing. So I don't expect that you've probably read those handouts word for word, but we tried to show you the three different major options of transfer, exchange, or sale, and the pros and cons for each of those, and an example of when you might use one ahead of another. For example, if you have a property with a land and water 6F boundary on it, well, if you want to sell that on the open market, that's a conversion, and you're going to be on the hook to replace it with property of like utility, recreation utility. And so is that the real gain for you there, or are you better off transferring it to the county parks or another entity who will go on and continue to manage it? So I really didn't want to spend a lot of time talking. I am very interested, as is Matt, in hearing what you think in terms of disposing of property. What do you think, would be the most important things for us to keep in mind as we work on this policy? And one of the first questions maybe we'll put out there for you is what determines statewide versus regional or local significance?
And part of the reason for, I'll just jump in, leading off with that question is, in past policy, both in kind of the disposition and the acquisition, we've identified that many, if not most of the lands that OPRD manages offer some level of statewide significance, whether that be to recreation, cultural resources, historic, scenic. And so we also do have parcels that, while they're pretty amazing pieces of property, they may not rise to that level of statewide significance, but they may hold significance for a local government or county government, different things like that. And so the idea behind this question is to help us pick that apart. How do we draw that line, or where do we draw that line?
Can I just ask a clarifying question? I think you guys touched on this and it just didn't lodge in my brain. The attachments you sent, like with the questionnaire and the criteria, are those things we've been actively using as we talk through this, or are these drafts that, so I'm just kind of, if you can remind me what the status is of those?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, as Matt said, we've got the acquisition policy, which is pretty much the administrative rule, and it's specific to OPRD. When it comes to disposition, we don't have one that's specific to OPRD. So we use the rules that are out there under state lands typically, and Department of Administrative Services. One of the things that we certainly need to be prepared to address anytime we're disposing of a piece of property is the assessment that we made of the environmental and cultural values of that. That's something that we even have a public hearing about if we're going to sell a property on the open market. So the property disposition questionnaire, that's something that, again, Alice and I came up with this some years ago as a way of capturing the criteria that had been agreed upon, and trying to give field staff a little bit more detail to work with. For example, is the property cost effective to maintain? Would it only require some, improvement or adjustment to make that more cost effective? So this property disposition questionnaire was meant to be a tool for site managers, and then a tool that we would share the results of, and that would sort of help with the decision making, basically. So whereas we don't have what we would call a current policy for disposition, we have some fairly current procedures, which have been used to varying degrees of success. It's sort of hard to look at. I mean, I couldn't even tell you how many thousands of land parcels that we have across the state. How do you assess and evaluate? Are there any low-hanging fruit? And I think that I would say those are the properties that we have probably worked most on, is something that's obvious. It's obviously not a good fit for the state park system anymore. Or there's obvious interest on the part of another entity to take on ownership of the property. And we'd love to be more proactive. It will require resources to do so. During COVID, we got down to one property agent, and thank goodness he didn't, have a heart attack on the job, because it's just a lot to try to keep up with the day-to-day activities of property management. And then of course there would be no time for these bigger picture strategies. So I guess that said, we have some tools. We hope to put those to good use. We probably were doing somewhere on the order of probably 2 or 3 dispositions a year. The sale of an easement to a neighbor next door is considered a disposition. Those are the low-hanging fruit that have some urgency to them that we need to be responsive as landowners to address. But I think in the time I was 2012 to 2019, I only did one land sale myself that was on the open market. And I think it was the first that had been done in a while. Alice, did quite a few, sales to neighboring landowners. We did exchanges before my time. Alice worked on some big exchanges with state lands. There's some real opportunities to work with our other state agency partners and potentially improve everybody's holdings. But it's a big undertaking. So to come up with sort of that umbrella policy about when is it we would choose to be, proactive? What is it that would tell us a property was ripe for considering to move out of the park system? We've kind of got the how, dictated to us via statute and rule, but it is that more overarching question about why, or which. And it might be that, maybe today what you would prefer to do is share with us, what would your perfect world look like if we could reposition? Are you opposed to disposal of property? Would you prefer we focus on transfers to other agencies for ongoing park purposes? Would you prefer we focus on properties that have that sort of high cost, whether that's a social, political cost? Is it staffing? Just the real dollars and cents of a property that's very costly to maintain and may not be a fit for current and future conditions.
Yes. You just nailed it. I'd start with, what are we spending more money on than we're getting value out of, because we got it from ODOT and it's just a piece of property hanging there costing us money, and the state of Oregon is not getting a hell of a lot of benefit out of it. That's where I'd start, with that list. And if that's our criteria and nothing more, we could sure get rid of a lot of property. And I'm in favor of getting rid of property rather than hanging on to it just because we like trees. We got lots of trees and we've got a lot of responsibility for a lot of trees. So let's concentrate our resources on the most important trees and the most valuable trees, and let this endless staffing of small things that don't add a lot of value find other ways to either manage or get rid of them. Because just more, I'd rather have a smaller inventory of more value than a bigger inventory that is costing more than we can afford. I don't know how to put it any more politely than that, but when I drive around and I see these little waysides and I think somebody's cleaning those bathrooms and taking care of those garbage cans, and how many visitors a day does it get? Mm-hmm. And then I think of the incredible needs we have at these massive properties that we are stewards of, and the whole coastline, for heaven's sakes, and all the needs we've got there. I'm less kind to the traveling, driving public, the ODOT hanger-ons, and way more interested in the future value or the value, the more global value of our system than the specific little traveling public pieces. And I know that our name is on a lot of traveling public pieces, and the public looks at that and says, that's what we are. And that's a shame that they think that's all we are, is that silly little, well, they're not silly. If you stop at them, they're nice. But that would be, I'd start with an inventory of those and say, how much does it cost us to maintain this? And how many visitors do we have? Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say, those are great points, Commissioner Berger. And I think, the list that Cammie mentioned earlier from a few years ago had a lot of those kind of sites on it that you were just describing. Some of the forest corridors, I think it was an example over here, the Blue Mountain State Scenic Corridor along 84, doesn't give a lot of value to the park system. It truly does not. And so those are some of the ones that make up that list that Cami was mentioning, but that's really helpful. That's exactly what we want to hear. Thank you.
Commissioner Dewar?
Actually, I believe Commissioner Allen had her hand up first.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Doug.
Okay. See if I can take my hand down here. There we go. Hey, anyway, it's good to see you all. I wish I could be seeing you in person in the Klamath Basin. And I am especially delighted, I have to say, to see Cami and Alice here. I'm really, really happy that you've come back and to spend a little more time with us, and to also help bring some clarity to these things at this moment, with where COVID has kind of caused us, like you'd mentioned, to reboot, to have to kind of go downscale significantly and then come back up again in terms of a lot of our work on these kinds of transactions. So it's really good to see you, both of you, involved with this. I agree in principle with a lot of what Commissioner Berger has just said, and she and I are very often on the same page on many things. I do, however, want to also express, as a person who loves parks and who has experienced a great deal of personal heartburn watching a few pieces of land be disposed before anybody on this call was involved with OPRD, that a great deal of caution is still indicated, especially when we have places with unique natural and cultural resource values, and places where the existence of those properties within the public domain really means something to people, to the constituency at large. And I think that there is often an expectation, rightly or wrongly, that OPRD lands are a permanent home, a holding place that ensures a certain level of conservation for lands in our and resources in our stewardship. And so I understand that everybody on this call appreciates that, but I also want to make that point clearly right on the tail end of what Commissioner Berger said, because we have this tremendous responsibility to take this very seriously. And I know everybody on this call is taking it very seriously. But I think in the practice of disposition, that there are so many little tangles that come up with this discussion of what constitutes a high priority property, for example. Many of the cases I think of, again, these are becoming kind of old to the point of practically historic now, things from 15 plus years ago. But there were cases where we saw parks that were relatively high priority, but where, let's say, pieces of those parks were being disposed of in different ways. And in some cases, we might realize later that those actually had some value. I think of some coastal parks, for example, where there's been erosion and so on, and yet pieces were lost, and suddenly that real estate means something, maybe a little differently than it did before. And so I guess that I'm eager to think about all the different scenarios, like you're saying, an umbrella policy that allows us to think about this wide range of scenarios, from an easement for a neighbor to outright sale of the property to how we deal with these incremental cases where we have a larger property and we're talking about disposing of some smaller piece of it, which was very much the pattern years ago in terms of how OPRD lands were being disposed of. And again, many, I think of the North Coastal parks that I know, and there were many examples where that was happening. And so with all of these arguments in the background, I also think to myself, always prioritizing the opportunity to create transfers in the public trust, transfers to tribes as well, that allow us to find good homes for property that may have more meaning to that other entity, whether it is a tribal entity or local government, a county, so on. We have many different tools in our kit, and I guess that I'm a big fan of, and I know this has been built into our policy in the past, but I want to reiterate the importance of it when the expectation in the public is that these things are being protected in the public domain, that we have really good tools to kind of click off other alternatives, other good homes. And only after those are really exhausted do we think about putting these things back out into the private sector, for all these reasons and more. I could keep rambling, but I just wanted to say that as a caveat, the yin-yang contrast with Commissioner Berger's statement, which is also on the mark. We, prioritizing these, getting good lists, those things that are high cost, low value, and beginning to look at things in those lights, but with the understanding that, as you say, losing these things is permanent. And we want to sort of grapple with the full weight of that when we are looking at a state in a period of dramatic flux. larger populations all the time, global warming, changing the configuration of shorelines, and opportunities in terms of fire management and just how we relate to the land overall. Many of these things are changing. And so often we have to also be thinking long-term and anticipating 100 years hence, this loss means something in that term, in those terms, not just our immediate short-term operational needs. And so also that means we think about a number of different criteria, and we think in a broader time frame than just our immediate operational needs at this moment. Again, everybody on this call knows this, but I just want to say it so we all have that out there. So anyway, thank you very much for letting me ramble on.
Thank you. Chair Allen?
That's okay. I'll just open it up for other folks. I think the last two comments covered a lot. I guess the one thing I was going to comment too was that I also appreciated in the criteria documents that you pulled together and the questionnaire that the sort of prompting to think both of the benefits and costs to OPRD of these decisions, but a lot of the questions you asked also were really helpful in terms of making sure that the benefits and costs to local communities or to things that might not be at a statewide level are sort of prompted and brought into the conversation. So I just want to say I really appreciated that, because I felt like that was a way of not just thinking what's right for OPRD and what's right for the things that make sense for us to spend our time and resources on, but also by prompting us to think about those other partners, and then therefore what might be the best pathway if it does make sense for us to dispose of something, to think about who and how. So I just wanted to highlight that I thought that was well done.
Thank you. And I think as you and Commissioner Dewar are pointing out, sometimes that local interest, is greater than we know, even the folks who work in the area. And there's a financial benefit often to a local community of having a state park. And so, of course, we weigh that as well. Commissioner Grasty.
There it is. Sorry, I have no idea why my video is not working, but hi, everybody. I wish we were face to face, but this works. So I also got to, I agree with everything that's been said, but I also got to think about a disposition policy may have significant impact on a decision to buy property. And I guess I want to make sure we think this thing through start to finish, and I'm not sure which end we start at or which end we finish on, acquiring things or letting it go at any point in the future. And I'm actually thinking about one of the things we're considering tomorrow. So it's I think there's some caution to that we don't box ourselves into a corner that we may need to get out of at some point in the future. But otherwise, I agree with everything everybody said.
Thank you. It makes me think that the criteria that we have for disposition was basically taking our criteria for acquisition and asking the same question in reverse, right? So, for example, I'll back up and look at my buffer. Property is not needed to buffer existing state park ownership, and that's one of the criteria for acquisitions. Is this an important property to create a buffer between the recreation and the urban interface, or what, some commercial activities that might be going on? Same thing around mission impact, enhancing existing areas. So, we have room to consider additional criteria. That's for sure. And if any of you think of criteria that we should be adding, or you think of criteria that you think should have more weight than the others, we're happy to hear that. But that's an interesting perspective, Commissioner Grazzi, about the policy we come up for disposition having impact on our acquisition policy as well.
So if I can say something more, you made me think of something there when you talked about acquiring property to buffer. This has been a huge issue in rural communities at times, that we have a wilderness area. People don't want development close to it because there's a wilderness area. So you have this de facto buffer around these areas that devalues people's property. And so when we think of that, that's a part of the issue in my mind about thinking, what's our disposition policy? How does it affect our acquisition policy? Of that buffer may have a huge impact on somebody's personal piece of property or some community. So it isn't, in fact, one of the examples that I worry about one policy affecting the other.
Thank you. That's a good example. Commissioner Blasher.
Cami, nice to see you. Good to see everyone. Yeah, I've been sitting here trying to mostly just agreeing with what everyone is saying and sharing, which is helpful, but trying to think through these things. I appreciate how you said that you're thinking of this as like the inverted process of acquisition, because I think that makes a lot of sense to be able to see sort of that process, but going backwards is a little bit different than going forwards. And so I think this is where maybe that question you brought up of like weighted. I don't know exactly which of these would be weighted, but there's probably something in this questionnaire that, like, some of the top half stuff is maybe a little bit more important than some of the details that you get into later in the questionnaire document. So there's probably a way in there. I guess you might be asking us at some point, like, what we think should be weighted in priorities. And I think it'd be helpful to maybe go through an exercise from a staff perspective of like, hey, if we were going to weight these or sort of prioritize maybe it's like you have to meet this threshold first before you go to this next category. That might help for us to give more concrete or additional sort of input and feedback on this. Something else that came up too, and I know it's part of the process in here, but I don't have a full grasp of across the state, what's the level of, public ownership of these natural, cultural, scenic, historic, recreational resources. And to Doug's point, there's definitely some of these things that, yeah, we might not have a ton of recreation activities programmed there, designed, but having that, through that conservation piece is really important. Or if there's cultural resources that are also important in that preservation. So it'd be interesting to get a sense of I know it's a big state, lots of different ownership entities, but even having some like order of magnitude of, where do we fit in that? My understanding is that a good chunk of the state is like federal BLM, right? But I couldn't say off the top of my head, like, oh, what percentage do we fit into? Because if we're a relatively small percentage, then it's changing maybe the sort of strategy and criteria when we're saying, hey, statewide, if you're asking that question of state versus regional, our role statewide is shifted potentially dramatically. And that would say, oh, here's where we'll focus in a little bit more granular in some of these key areas. And yeah, so that's just some additional thoughts I had. And so I don't know where other agencies play into this. And then something else that came up was maybe part of this is not necessarily a like top-down questionnaire, and that's not necessarily how you all are using it, but is it more of like I don't know, you make like a process map almost, and these are conversation starters, and at certain points you'll understand, oh, hey, this property is this have high significance or not, and start getting into more conversations, and sort of you realize, oh, we actually don't need to go that far into the questionnaire if we realize, oh, this is a big stop with, and then we're done, or yes, we're still going down that. So some sort of different way to think of how you work through this. And then the other pieces, I don't know where in this comes up with like the urgency and importance, it's like some of these things become a little bit more maybe time bound if there's something that's a greater risk or something. And so that's another dynamic to put in there, is whereas there's something that's just important versus something that's maybe really urgent that's coming up and needs to be managed sooner. So, and in general, I support us, disposing of properties that don't meet that highest and best use of the public in our purview, and but I think also like when there are opportunities to continue taking care of and protecting these places, and as long as the public thinks that we do a good job across all of our different agencies and all of that, then we continue to do that. And until there's some greater message that this needs to be more private ownership, then we'll cross those bridges at that point. But yeah, it's harder to everything, prices will go up and everything, so it's maybe sometimes easier to hold on to it, take care of it at that right service level for the long run, knowing that we're in this for generations. And so those are some musings that I have. Appreciate having the chance to think through this a little bit more, and yeah, it's nice to see folks.
Thank you. Commissioner Dewar.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up and just say I really appreciate what the prior commissioners have just said, Commissioner Blasher and Steve as well. I think that raised a lot of interesting points, and it is true that several points were true. I could list a few, but I think that Commissioner Blasher's point, for example, about just our level of significance almost varies from place to place within the state. When I'm speaking here as somebody representing west of the Coast Range, the coast really is a place where we are a very visible presence in terms of public land. We are the keeper of the treasures for a great deal of the coast, whether they are recreational, natural resource, cultural resources. We really are a key figure in that. Other parts of the state, there are other agencies, other land management agencies that really have a very active role regionally, you could say. They're much more of a presence regionally. They really affect how people think about their home place a little differently. And so I know that my perspective is a little bit skewed in one direction because of the fact that on the coast, really State Parks has had such a very visible role in all of that. And so that point that Commissioner Blasher makes about the regional differences, I think is actually consequential, might actually affect some of our thinking about how we prioritize place and what that means. And again, I do think that, again, following up on Commissioner Blasher's points, that there is also these other categories of resources. And I think that I always find it interesting how many people outside of OPRD, I know within OPRD, we understand the recreational mission being very, very top tier, but simultaneously, there are so many people who you encounter who think of our role as so much more in these other domains: natural resource protection, cultural resource protection, and oh, by the way, somewhere in there you do recreation as well. And so there's a certain kind of metric that has to kind of factor in all those variables, and I know that we're all thinking along those lines as well. But recreational function alone it's interesting and complex in terms of how that's prioritized in decisions about disposition. But I do know, to follow up on Commissioner Grasty's point, that I have personally had people who are considering donating lands or to OPRD who have backed away from that and let me know that it was watching what happened on some disposition issues over the last, let's say, 2 decades, 3 decades, that caused them to not work with us, but to go elsewhere. And those are, in fact, in one case that comes to my mind, it was a family that actually had donated to us previously and chose not to. Because they had seen publicly, they'd seen, press coverage, rightly or wrongly, in terms of what was said in the press coverage. There was a perception that their lands donated might be at risk of future disposition, and that wasn't considered satisfactory. And obviously, we have tools in the kit to deal with that. We have different kinds of contractual tools to make sure that we provide assurances to donors that those lands are protected. Simultaneously, it is a perceptual issue, and it does factor into our discussions about acquisition. And I think of other acquisitions that may be on the horizon, potentially for OPRD, where those things might factor in significantly, because people are, when they, I think, work with OPRD, they, in many cases, not all, but they're looking for a good forever home, as they say, for stray dogs or stray properties. they're looking for a good forever home for that property, and they really want to make sure that we're it. And so, continuing to be very clear about those guarantees and how enforceable are those guarantees at the time of donation, and what does that mean? All of that has to be kind of factored into what we say about disposition. So I appreciate Commissioner Grasty's point on that. I have seen that in practice, and it does matter. Thank you.
And that brings up an interesting point. In my mind, for some of the properties that we have talked about disposition being a potential best move when there is a deed restriction. It came through a donation, there's a deed restriction, therefore it must be used, for state park purposes. It's so hard to look into the glass and know what 50 years from now will bring. But we just, as decision makers, you do your best to decide whether or not that's in the best interest of the park system. And I'm certainly not trying to say that the majority of properties that we've talked about for disposition have deed restrictions. That's not the case. But there are odds and ends here and there that we accepted as donations with maybe not, realizing what that might mean to us down the road. And then there are other parks that we received through donation that are gems and forever, will help define OPRD. So thank you for that comment. Would any other OPRD staff have comments or questions that they would want to put on the table?
I guess the only thing I'd throw in there, Cami, is we also, not because we're under a declaration of cooperation with the local park providers, but I think it's also just the right thing to do and a good thing to do, even if it's a high value property. If one of us can serve it better than the other and the efficiencies are realized and the benefit to the public is there, I think we need to consider, not that I'm saying Fort Stevens or Silver Falls, but in some cases, like Whalen Island is an example that I'm probably going to, continue to die on as the director. I don't understand why Clay Myers and Whalen Island have the exact same driveway and two government entities show up there every day to clean restrooms on the opposite side of the line. It seems very inefficient. They're both very iconic, incredible places to have, but it shouldn't be managed and run the way that it is. And I think we need to look at more of those and say where and how could those properties and the public be served better? Because we all know that the public doesn't always really know a park is a park, right? They don't know who owns it. They don't know who's managing it. They don't know that we don't own Detroit Lake. They don't know that we don't own Joseph Stewart. We've done a really good job managing those places, but I think it is our responsibility to talk about how we can better co-manage and represent the state of Oregon's recreation needs. So that's it.
Thank you. Commissioner Grasty and then Dennis.
So it occurred to me, I guess first off, since we had the best attorney ever, it might be worth having him have a discussion for us in regards to how easily local government, I'm somewhat familiar with restrictions on county government, but how local government can or cannot dispose of parks. And that may help us in making a decision about putting land to sorry, I got a granddaughter calling. How important is that? The counties are really restricted. Once you declare a property a park, it's almost impossible to dispose of it. So that point may be helpful for us to know whether that applies to just county government or all local government. And anyway, it may help us frame the disposition if it's going to go to another government entity.
Thank you. Dennis?
Yeah, so along the lines of what Lisa was talking about, I see a lot of value in properties that may not fit our portfolio perfectly, but still have a great recreational value. For instance, down in Curry County, they're trying to start up a park program. And if we have a bunch of parks that we're traveling 15 miles to go clean a bathroom each day, and it really doesn't serve any much more purpose than a neighborhood park, but they would like to take it on, there's going to be opportunities around the state for those kinds of things where it's a property disposition, but it's not getting it out of recreation. It's and so as long as we have and I like the idea of those 24-year leases or whatever, so that it always comes back if they can't fulfill what they were obligated to do. We may have some dog property that we just want to get rid of to the public, but I don't know that we have very much of that. Really, this is more along the lines of who the right entity is to operate a recreational location and not use it for their investment to then flip so that they have more money to buy property, but actually put those restrictions on it when we do lease it out to them. Because even like a Yachats State Park right in the downtown of Yachats, if there is a downtown, that one seems like more like a city park that they would manage better than we would, and they would actually qualify for those pass-through dollars with LWCF to improve them that we may or may not try to do because it's not a priority to us. And so there's ways that the state could, or different recreation providers could improve the things that we all offer by it not being owned by us, but obligated to recreation in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Shipsey.
Hi, everybody. The invitation was given. I don't know the answer to the restrictions on local government, particularly cities, but it does occur to me that one of the opportunities we would have, something Dennis just mentioned, is a lease period. But also, like any other property owner, I believe we could put a restriction on a park as part of our disposition that would afford us that protection that we're after. So that was just one thought.
Thank you. And in fact, we do, if we do a no cost transfer of the deed to an eligible entity, we always have a reversionary clause in there, requiring them to continue to use it. We typically will say for public purposes, but sometimes we will say for park purposes. And so on the one hand, what this does is guarantee the ongoing access for the public. And on the other hand, it guarantees our ongoing engagement in the property. And that may be just right. It is that sort of insurance. And I can tell you that I got a phone call once from somebody over in Sisters telling me about trees being cut on a property that had been conveyed to the city. So we do get those sorts of opportunities to remind the recipient of what the intent was. And that one got cleared up just fine. You know, they were clearing trees so that they could provide more recreation amenity, and they weren't taking out, you know, highly significant trees. So, but that is a statute with a no cost transfer. There will always be a reversionary clause. So I think Commissioner Berger and then Dewar.
I have to say, in light of the previous discussion about legislation that passed Congress in 1964 that is tying us up in regulatory knots as we speak, that any policy that says Commissioner Durr, bless the people's heart who didn't give us that property, but I don't want property that's so encumbered by people's need for legacy that I have enough issues of my own. I don't need their legacy issues too. And even though the property may be valuable, there's a reason to say no, and there's a reason to get rid of things, even though at some later date it may be a mistake. The right decision now is the right decision now, and it's never going to be right always, and it's never going to be right in perpetuity. So I'm more of a get rid of the stuff we know we need to get rid of, because there's plenty of that. And then case by case, some of these other bigger issues and bigger property, getting rid of things issues, because I have felt ever since I looked at our system that there's a lot of junk in it, and I want to get rid of it. And the harder ones, the ones that may have more significance to the local government, to the tribes, to whoever our partners are, those are tougher nuts, but I think there's low-hanging fruit, and I would like to get at it forthwith so that we can have more time to work on the tougher, more difficult issues. And Lisa, I go to Wayland Island on a regular basis. God help you. I don't know what you're going to do there, but if I can help, let me know.
I'm going to make the t-shirts now, Vicki.
I'm sorry. I know I'm kind of just get rid of it is what I sound like, but it isn't that. It's that I want to clear out the inventory of the low-hanging fruit without tying us up in legacy issues forever, legacy issues that we will never resolve, because these are in lots of ways the long-term use of our resources is our purpose. And there isn't a single answer. There's only the best answer at this moment going forward. And be very mindful of legacy issues tying you up in regulatory knots, like the discussion we just had about all these properties that we're sitting there managing because somebody put a park there, and we're on the hook forever to be basically a functionary around it. And we don't like being functionaries, but we have to have staff, and the Park Service obviously doesn't have staff, and that makes it worse. And I was just reading an article where the whole public sector is just draining staff, and it's coming up in the teacher corps right now, but I know it's going to come up in yours and every other agency's portfolio. So let's manage what we have to manage with the staff we've got and try and work towards the low-hanging fruit fairly forthwith, is how I feel about it. And I'm going to be gone in another year from this thing, and you don't have to worry about me saying, get rid of that highway thing.
Dennis?
Yeah, so I was thinking back a little bit to some other of the angles that come up in property. And one of them was back when we were charged with putting a state park in Washington County, and it was called Harris Canyon. Now it's Stubbs Stewart State Park, and they have a campground, a lot of trails, a lot of activity up there, and associated with a lot of the rail to trails as well. And we ended up trading off some property that we owned on the North Coast to get that property. And so that overwhelming public benefit or public good phrase sometimes may not hit the local place where that property's traded off for a greater good, where we have people coming from all over the place to camp at Stubbs Stewart, where the property that we traded off had timber value and this pretty steep slope, I believe. And so it was not ever going to be developed as a recreation property. So there are going to be times when the greater public good is possibly trading off property that we own that's beautiful, but not recreation bound to get something greater. And so that should be in the language as well of how you can make a determination to trade up, even if that trade is hard to swallow for some people.
So Doug, you had your hand up and then it went down. Was that intentional, or was that because I had said you were up next?
It's complex. I wanted to, I guess, quite some time back, I was going to express broad support for what Dennis was saying about all the opportunities for consolidation of operations with other entities, and what Lisa had said as well. I think that that's eminently defensible, especially if we can establish that the recipient entity obviously has the capacity to continue to manage the land in the way that's consistent with OPRD's original intent with ownership and management and so on. And those are opportunities that are wonderful, and they do fit the criteria as low-hanging fruit. And I think that those might be a really high priority target going forward for this kind of thing. And I you know, for all of my talk about needing to be cautious and our obligation to with the public trust, I do think that that's something that we can all support. So I wanted to express that. Simultaneously, there are other aspects to this. I'll have to. I was going to express just broad support in general for everything Dennis says, although there are a couple technical points I'll have to discuss with him maybe over here sometime. But generally speaking, a broad support for everything Dennis says by and large. And but I do think that I still stand by the idea that we really want to be cautious with our disposition policy because of a number of things, obviously, including how it reflects acquisition strategy, because there are things that we definitely want. And I get Commissioner Berger's kind of point about we don't want a patchwork of a lot of little legacy pieces and so forth. The case in point that I was thinking of, where we actually had a family not proceed with a donation to OPRD, was what we would call one of our iconic parks and a fairly significant potential donation. And so it wasn't just a knockoff and some little piece, postage stamp piece out in the middle of nowhere. It has consequences. It definitely has consequences. And I'll stand by that point, although I do agree that we don't want this endless muddle of complexity that keeps us from really doing our really adhering to our core mission in an effective way. So anyway, but I think we're all kind of on the same page. Basically, we're all just kind of looking at different aspects of this and wanting to make sure it doesn't get lost in the overall discussion. And so I'll stop there. So as I said, it was complex. I took my hand down intentionally, but I appreciate the chance to say that.
And I'm looking forward to the beer.
JR.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in briefly, and this will get nods from Lisa because she said it for a lot of years. But part of the issue is when we have a mission statement that's so broad, it allows for a lot of interpretation. And I think Vicky's point is a great one, and I think it's a lot that our park staff feel, which is our park staff interpret it as like efficiency of operation and how do you maintain parks as a park and provide recreational access and access to the public. But through good intentions or different interpretations, we've ended up with dozens of properties that are conservation properties or reserve properties that have no recreation happening on them or very little. Oftentimes they don't even have access to them. And so there's some philosophical like soul searching as to what is our mission. And because those properties do, take staff time and cost and oftentimes we're putting restoration dollars into them. And so while there's a public benefit, it's always where that nexus fits with our mission. And I think Doug had a great point as far as how we look at as not just disposition, but acquisitions. And I would say for the last several years, we've been a lot more picky on what we would not only acquire, but accept. And that we've started to pivot ourselves saying, we'll assist and facilitate property transfers. The East Moraine at Willow Lake is a great example that we said, we'll put staff time and money and effort into assisting getting this property to the county to the expense of donating a property to go along with it. And so I think I think that's a great pivot, but it's not codified. It's almost been more of just a management strategy. And so, to me, I welcome this whole discussion, but also putting some flesh on the bone in writing down these strategies, just so we can kind of help protect that, because 1 5-year period with a different philosophy, and we end up with 25 more properties that we can't ever get rid of. And because while, Matt's example of some of our timber parcels along highways or some of these unbuilt wayside properties are pretty easy to get rid of, some that have significant either cultural resources or or other values, we're not getting rid of them. It's like there's too much outcry unless we can find another entity. And so I really appreciate, and I think it will really help the staff for us to go through this process, I think, going forward on whatever that pivot is, because I know we have an interpretation. But you know, I've just Vicky's point and how she's explained it versus some other points expressed are two different points of view. And so it's like that's I think the balance we're always trying to strike. So I really am happy that we're kind of discuss this and be able to put a foot down a little bit, a little more definitively one way or the other.
So seeing no hand, I might ask a question regarding process when it comes to policy development. Is there a public comment piece to policy development or not? And I'm remembering back the acquisition policy, which was adopted shortly before I joined OPRD, but because that was OAR, I think maybe that, oh, good. Our attorney, thanks, Steve.
So there wouldn't be a statutory requirement for a public comment period. It would be something that would be elective. And, you know, this is, you bear in mind, this is policy. If you want it to be binding or something you want to rely on, like the acquisition policy, it would need to be put into OAR. But if it's just to guide the commission in decision-making, it probably could just remain at the policy level.
Great, thank you. I think my understanding of the way the rules are, as I said, you know, we have adopted administrative rule for acquisition. And so DAS, Administrative Services, recognizes that, and we don't have to follow their rules when it comes to acquisition. But when it comes to disposition, that's where, because we don't have adopted, I guess, process through the rulemaking process, then we still will have those sideboards, right, of statute and rule. And when we would hold a public hearing, I'm thinking back to Washburn Wayside. I can't even remember how many acres. I'm going to say about 30. And it had been established as a wayside, and over time had lost its significance. And it was really thoroughly looked at in terms of cultural significance and environmental significance, and no endangered species were found. It had been a Blue Star Highway site. So, you know, there was some interest in that. And I believe Chris Havel worked with a local group to find a new home for that site. But overall, we had a public hearing as required in the local community. And overall, there was not overwhelming, there was support for us to dispose. I guess I'll say that they were, because of the other park development that had occurred nearby, I think that the locals were able to support seeing this property go into private ownership, because that was something that was important in their community. Any other, I know we've gone past our time. I wonder if there's any other comments anyone would like to make for us.
Did you get what you need from us today or this afternoon? Because like if we haven't sort of helped give you what you need for right now, then it'll be good for us to go back to the drawing board and make sure we can be helpful and useful for staff to know what type of things to potentially be bringing to us here in the not too distant future.
I feel like this has been helpful, and there's been some good conversation and some good suggestions and opportunity for staff to work on this and maybe, you know, have some real life examples on how this would play out. And Matt, I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like once we got rolling, we got some really pretty phenomenal feedback from you all. I can't thank you enough. Actually, I wasn't going to take notes, but I couldn't stop. And I know Chris was also taking some notes for us. I think there's a lot for us to go back and start putting something together. Again, you know, when we come back to you in November, it'll be another workshop. So it's just simply going to be another review process. And I feel like, unless Cami says otherwise, I do feel like we've got what we need to get to that next step.
Yep, and then we'll put you to work again and be asking for guidance on how we can improve whatever it is we draft. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank you too also for, I think the materials you did provide and sort of giving us food for thought were super helpful and really rich conversation. So thanks to everybody who brought us to this stage.
Great conversation, everybody. I'm sorry we're not down at Collier, but I was there on Friday, and I want you to know that something that somebody else disposed of is getting great use. And yeah, it's hard to see. I'll get out of your way. But see, dispositions are not a terrible thing.
I wanted to see that. I'm sorry we're not down there.
I'm sorry too, Vicki. It was a tough call. I think it was the right call, but it was a
No,
very
it was
tough
the right
call.
call. I don't want to be, frankly, I don't want to be in a van for hours with somebody who might have been exposed to COVID. I get that.
Yeah. But I just wanted you to know it was the day before it was really, really smoky. Air quality was horrible. But the following day it worked, and we hit Crater Lake in the morning and it was really smoky. And by afternoon it was beautiful, and Oregon showed up perfectly for the rest of the country. So sorry we're not there, but they're doing great. And the park looks fantastic and they miss you.
I just also want to say I had the chance to attend a little bit of the conference last week, and just kudos to Lisa and all the staff that were there. It was really nice to see a lot of folks in person. But they were such great feedback, and kudos from everybody I encountered, talked to, ran into. You guys ran an amazing conference. So I just want to say that was amazing. And so far I've tested negative. So I'm also like really.
Yay! It's my new morning ritual.
I do see Commissioner Grasty has a hand up.
So I'm sitting here listening to this, and I really am sorry we're not together. I like our meetings a lot better when we're together, but incredibly last night, we got 0.4 of an inch of rain, and not very broad in the county, but holy mackerel, was that appreciated. And I was glad to be home for that.
Bring
May
on the
we all
rain.
get some rain. Yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
Okay. Well,
All right.
thanks for the good feedback. That gives
Appreciate your
us
time.
lots to work with.
Everybody has links for both the executive and business meetings. Is everybody all set as far as that goes? And lots of nodding. Yay. Okay. I'm sure everything's going to go fine. So we will see you bright and early tomorrow morning for exec.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you
Have a
again.
wonderful week, all.